Welcome, everybody. Come on in. Welcome, everybody. Come on in. We'll give everybody a couple minutes to get in. It looks like we're probably waiting on still a few people, but while everybody's getting settled in here, I just want to, first of all, welcome everybody, introduce myself. My name's Scott Wiener. The other face you're seeing right here is Peter Regas. He is not frozen in real life. He's frozen on his computer screen. But it's okay. We can let him do that. I do want to let everybody know that I want to keep everybody muted during this event. So
okay.
Everybody is automatically set to be muted. So if you're unmuted right now, it means you probably hit a button. So do me
Yes, okay.
Yeah, go back and mute yourself. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of a mess. And I'm also going to ask everybody to turn their video off, just because that'll help us with bandwidth. And I want everybody to be able to see what's going on. Later in this event, I would love to have some people turn their video on. And if that's going to happen, I'll probably invite you to turn your video on, and I'll let you know who it is, who, if there's anybody in particular. There are a lot of great people in this event tonight beyond just our guest speaker. So I do want to let everybody know exactly what this event is all about, and who we are, who are running this event, and where we're coming from, and all that. But I do want to just remind everybody, we're going to keep everybody on mute for the entire time. And the only people who will not be on mute will be myself, and it will be Peter, who is our special guest. So I do want to let everybody know that Peter Regas is here. He and I will be running the event, which is called Rewriting Pizza History. And the idea of the event is to give everybody some information about early pizza history in America, which is something that both Peter and I are, I guess I can say, obsessed with. Peter, would that be accurate?
Yeah, it's a little pejorative, but I'll go along with that.
Look, we have to be in this case. We're going to get really specific later, but right now, I think let's just be fair. I'll be honest. I'm obsessed, and I know you are. I'll just call you out. So I want to let everybody know also that this is being recorded. So if in the future you want to reference this, we will be posting this at some point in the near future. So let us know if you can't find it, and we'll be able to help you find it. My name is Scott Wiener. I run a company based in New York called Scott's Pizza Tours, where we take people to significant pizzerias around New York City. We also do a lot of work with charity. We have a charity called Slice Out Hunger, where we raise money for hunger relief organizations all around the country through pizza-related events and campaigns. Also run a website that's launching next week called Pizza Resource Center. I write for a pizza trade magazine called Pizza Today. I judge pizza competitions. I have moved my Guinness World Record pizza box collection out of the view, so you don't have to see it in my background. But suffice it to say, everything that I do is pizza related, which is why I find this topic severely of interest. And my guest co-host here tonight is Mr. Peter Regas. Peter, you want to introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are?
Yeah, my background is in math and statistics, so I'm a pizza amateur by contrast to Scott. But I first came onto this subject in about 2007, 2008. I looked at Jeff Verasano's page, which, if you haven't seen it, it was originally about how to replicate the Patsy's recipe, and it goes on and on and on. It was sort of famous for a few years in the late 2000s. And I got smitten by this whole thing, and I was particularly interested in the history. And I was reading about it, and there were things about the public history at that time that seemed off to me, that seemed questionable, that seemed like someone should take a deeper dive into it. But I wasn't going to get really into it because I'm not a writer, I'm not a historian, I'm not Italian, I'm not an Italian speaker. But I got kind of roped into it. And it started in Chicago with trying to do a history of deep dish, just as an amateur, again, just no big deal. And I started finding things that were new, and finding things that I know would be of importance, at least in Chicago. And then about a year into that project, which was just a part-time thing, strictly going to be the labor of love, I found something about the Lombardi story that I knew would be nationally significant. And what that is, briefly, is I found out a man's name by the name of Francisco Dorico in a city directory in the 1910. I knew enough about the Lombardi story that that name should not have been there at the time. So that started the ball rolling. Once I found that, then I knew I had my guns to find the truth about the New York story too. So that's how this whole started. That was, in 2009 when things got really going. I found the Dorico name in 2010, got in contact with the descendants of the family in about spring of 2010. I met Scott for the first time on his tour in 2011. And that was the height of finding what we're going to display for you today. So all this stuff for me, I found in 2010 to about 2013. Those were the years that were the most productive. I'm still finding things, but it's getting harder and harder as the years go on. Anyway, that's who I am, and feel free to start the presentation whenever you want to, Scott.
Yeah, I do want to let everybody know a couple things just for clarification. If you've just logged in right now, don't worry, you haven't missed anything yet, but I do want to explain that my name's Scott Wiener. Peter Regas just finished speaking. You'll see my image on the side of the screen. And the only reason that Peter's image is a big black box, it's not because he's trying to stay hidden. It's because his connection is a little fuzzy right now. So if he turns on his video, it'll freeze his face. So Peter, if you get a chance, turn on your video for a second just so the folks can see that you are here and your face will be frozen. Try to make it a good face. Also, we'll see if it happens. There it is. Look at that face. Look at that punum. I also want to let everybody know that there is a chat function in this Zoom window. So if you have a question or if you have something to say, please put it in that chat window and I will take a look at that at some point and I'll pose the question for Peter and we'll try to get things answered if we can. If you're watching this after the fact, I apologize, but there will not be a chat window for you. Also, I do want to say, when I remember meeting Peter for the first time was, I think it was the first time when you were on the tour, and I believe I gave a date of a photograph, which we will talk in depth about. I gave a date of a photograph that's not the commonly known date of that photograph. Peter said something to me and kind of with like a side eye look and sort of like, there was a slight understanding that I had done more research than some of the like Wikipedia research. And from then on, it's just been really interesting. So about a year and a half ago, Peter and I and my research partner, Liz Migliori, who's here in the room right now, we've been talking a lot about this stuff. And it's the point of this conversation that we're going to present to you right now is to establish some information that is not already published and to create a space for that to exist. Peter's been working on a book, and before that book comes out, he's publishing on his website, on his blog. And this video will be kind of a component of what we hope will be a good reference for people. That's why Peter has assembled a lot of documents, photos, things that we can show you in this video that can be referenced in the future. Is that fair to say, Peter?
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm going to be posting about the things I'm talking about today in the next week or so. I'm a bit of a procrastinator, so I'm going to hold myself to that. But I'd appreciate if the images that are shown today are kept here and not posted on any social, the groups or anything. I want to get the post up and I want to give sort of a definitive analysis of what we're going to talk about today. I'm actually going to go probably more detail on the post. But for this, it's, I think we're going to have sufficient amount of the detail for you.
So I think it's a good idea to start with, obviously the reason that we're doing this is because there's the versions of stories about pizza's foundation in New York City are more complex than previously thought to have been. So can we just lay out who are the big players and what was the story that we've all heard? And then we can talk about what was not entirely correct about that story. Can you just bring us through, Peter, some of the pizzerias and the names of the pizza makers who are, for us at least, common knowledge?
Sure. The story gained prominence, at least in the 1990s, when Lombardi's Pizzeria reopened up on 32 Spring Street. And that led to a number of New York Times articles that I can just generally characterize as the tree theory of how pizza came to America. And really, when we're talking pizza, we're talking pizzerias at this point. And so the theory or the story from the New York Times was this: Lombardi was the trunk of the tree. He was the source of training pizza the makers that later continued their career all across New York City and even the East Coast of the United States. That was the story that came out when Lombardi started to reopen in the mid-90s. And in the 2000s, in the early to mid 2000s, it gained more currency when people started to do books about pizza coming back, sort of artisanal pizza. They took another look at what was the history of pizza in the United States. And again, when we see that, we're almost immediately going directly to who owned what, where, and how long ago did they own their pizzeria. And the common story, and Scott, you can well remember this, in the 2000s up to the late, even the 2010s, that story of the Lombardi story at 53.5 Spring Street dominated everything. And the two biggest facts that they brought out in the story was this photograph that you see in front of you here of 53.5 Spring Street. The man on the left is Antonio Pero, and the man on your right is Gennaro Lombardi, the proprietor at that given time. And they claimed that it was the first licensed pizzeria in the United States. And those were the two key facts. So very simple. Here's the photograph, which they claimed later on was taken in the 1905. And their family story was they were the first licensed pizzeria in the United States. That's what we were dealt with at the time. And I thought at the time that that was a curious story, because how did they know that? How did they know the date of the photograph? How did they know they were the only licensed pizzeria? And where's the license? So these are just natural things that would come up to anyone. And that's how I started in the late 2000s with the research. Scott, do you think that's about right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I also should just say that we're talking about Gennaro Lombardi, who's on the right, Peter just mentioned, Antonio Pirro, who went off to open Totonno's in Coney Island, and how that story that had been printed, there was that 1998 article, Eric Asimov in the New York Times, which had this family tree and kind of cementing the story in the New York Times, pretty big deal. And same thing I ran into when I started running pizza tours. I thought, oh, the story says Gennaro Lombardi worked at a grocery store 1895 or 1897, depending on which article you read, and then bought the pizzeria and got the first license in 1905. And my thought was, I run this pizza tour, I should have a copy of that license. Started looking for it, couldn't find any license, and then it sort of snowballed. So, okay, so if that's the story, then where do you start researching that? And what's the first little blip that comes up? You mentioned the Dorico family.
Well, yeah, so when I found the Dorico family, I knew enough that if they started in the 1905 with the pizzeria, I should be able to find Gennaro Lombardi in the business directory. But where in the
Peter,
business?
let's step back a second. Where do you physically go to start this research?
Well, so I was in the Newberry Library, which is a heavily genealogical library. It's rather specialized in Chicago for that purpose, for the public to come in for free and go on the microfilms, and they have an extensive collection and go through them page by page. So the distinction is we didn't have the time, the ability just to search online to find an address, a name, a directory. You had to go through the spool of the microfilm page by page and look for specific names.
So there's not just one big reel of microfilm. There's microfilm of census and of business directories. What piece of film do you go for first?
Well, the first one I went to is the 1905, and I was trying to look up Gennaro Lombardi's name, and there's two types of directories that you can see. You can see the general one, which has everyone by the last name, so that would be the first easiest the one to do. I couldn't find him there. Then I looked at the business directory, which is segmented by or segregated by type of business. So it has all the bakers by alphabetical the name. It has all the restaurateurs by alphabetical name. It has all the grocers. So I either thought it was a baker, a grocer, or a restaurant at the time of the 1905. So in one of those, I should be able to find them. Well, I didn't find them at all. So no Lombardis at all I found, even close. So I thought that was strange. So I started to go in '06, '07, '08, '09. And then by the 1910 one, I got frustrated because I couldn't find anything. I thought, well, this is nuts. So then I started to go, not by the last name, I went by their address. So I
So
knew
instead of looking for Lombardi, you decided, let me look at 53 Spring,
53 string or 53 and a half spring, right.
which it's
So,
not listed by street.
right, so that's the problem there is you have to go through every name in the subject area. So all the bakers you have to start with, all the grocers, which at the time, now it doesn't seem like a big deal to me, but at the time it was like, do I really want to do that? That's kind of nuts. I'm conditioned to do all that sort of the crazy stuff. But luckily enough, in the 1910 one, I got to about the third page, and I got to Dorico and Francisco Dorico, in fact, and said 53 and a half Spring Street under Baker. And literally within a second or two, I knew immediately I had a national story because I'd never heard his name before. There's no Lombardi there, and something's wrong. That should not have happened. And the key thing too is that they don't put the workers in there. They put the proprietors in there. So they only have space for who actually owns the businesses for obvious financial and advertising the reasons. So for Francisco Dorico to be the owner of 53 and a half Spring Street, the bakery, that seemed very, very odd. So the next thing is actually to find who he was. So that's how I got deep involved into all this stuff.
Great. So, okay, so now you know that the original story that we've known for years has more to it. You find this name, Dorico. Where do you go next? It seems like there's a web of information out there. Where do you decide you might start?
As best I can remember, I can go back to each of the files that I took on this. I think I tried to find his descendants because I knew it would be a fantastic story. At least I highly thought it would be. And luckily enough, the Dorico families, Francisco Dorico's son had died in his 90s. And so it was a fresh obituary, but not just fresh, it was very detailed. Like they had all the names. There was no doubt that's the family. And I saw that, I said, well, this is not that hard. So I started to find the numbers of that guy's son, Armando's sons, and he had at least two. And I called the one up. I didn't get a hold of the other one. And then I called the other in nearby Atlanta, Georgia. And within the first 10 seconds, I said, I'm doing research on Italian-American bakers. I found the name Francisco Dorico. I think I'd be interested in hearing his story. And Donnie Dorico, just the first thing he said to me, do you know where my grandfather had his bakery? And I said, I think I know this is going to be a good story. So he knew the story, or at least he knew a part of the story. So the family actually knew he had the pizzeria, as they said now, before Lombardi. They sold it to Gennaro Lombardi. And of course, I was all ears to hear whatever they had to tell me, if they had any photographs, what the family story had been, what happened, how did they know the Lombardis? So all that stuff in. So it got to the point I think it was later that year, or it might have been the next year, that I actually went out to Gloversville, New York. I think right after I actually took your tour, Scott. And they were super nice. And I hung out with them for about 2 or 3 days and got to know the family a bit. And, that was about, 10 years ago. So it's an amazing time from that. So that led to me, it was sort of like me getting deeper into the web. Once I got into that, then it became even more intriguing. I started finding more stuff, and it starts to dominate your life. So this is not a professional thing. I don't expect to make any money off it at all, but it's a labor of love. So it took up an enormous amount of time those first years because I was finding things which led to other things, and I was learning, and it just sort of fed on itself. So the next obvious thing to do would be to look at this famous photo. So up until I found something probably about 2013, I still had a nagging sense that the Lombardis probably had some part of their story that was about the 1905 story that was right. And I wasn't sure. All these things were going through my mind. Was he a silent partner? Was he in partnership with Dorico? Did he sell it back to Dorico? What was going on? So came back to the photograph, and the obvious thing about this photograph that we see in front of us here is, what year was it actually shot? When did they actually take this photo? And that's the question. How do you determine that? And do you want to get into that now, Scott?
Yeah, I do want to mention to people that the version of the photo that you're seeing right now is this colored version of it that was made in the mid-1990s when Lombardi's was preparing to reopen after being closed for 8 years. And that kind of kicked off the whole resurgence of this history. But if you zoom out a little bit, in 1994 or 1993, whenever they did this photo, and I know Andrew is, I believe, in the room, he was the one who took this to the photographer to touch up. It says, if you back out, Lombardi's in 1905, and this is the thing that makes everybody say, okay, it's 1905. But I know when Peter and I first met, I had only just gotten under the surface of this story, and the one little smoking gun that I'd found was that this was not taken in 1905. And Peter, why don't you take us through this photo and let's talk about when this might have been taken.
Right, so if you see the Pizzeria Napolitana, clearly it says General Lombardi as the proprietor there, so that's very significant. But if you notice, you look closely at the font of it and the color of the font of it, or at least the tone of the font of it. The coloring could be, but it's more probable the font. You see a different font between the Pizzeria Napolitana and the name Gennaro Lombardi, which is interesting, but not in any way definitive. You see Gennaro Lombardi, you wonder how old he is, which naturally goes to when was he born. And you see the poster boards inside the window there. And you see numbers, you see ward, you see a bunch of things. So why not zoom in on the poster board that says 14th Ward, and you do that and you see this. There we go. You see that. And so this is the black and white, the version of the same thing. The key thing here we see under the 14th Ward originals, we see Wednesday, the 25th of November, which leads you to get a big clue there, because that only appeared at certain years on a cyclical basis. And the years that are relevant for us in the discussion are between the 1903, 08, and the 1914. So unless you're going to say that this was lingering in the window for years on end, it's either around November of those years. And the question then is, which year is it? And we can go back to another clue, and we see Gennaro Lombardi. So we actually determined when he officially came to the United States by the manifest that we found. So this is the official one. When you leave the port of the Naples, they take your name and information down, and it's important for the shipping the company, so they try to get it very good and right and correct. And this is the day that he came into the port of the New York, November 23rd of 04. So that means, and it also says, by the way, that this is the first time he's come into America. So we can eliminate the 1903 with pretty high confidence at that point. But we still have two other years that it could be. It could be the 1908 or the 1914. So we get a third clue.
Wait, Peter, can you just go back one slide for a second? Just since you already have it here, let's point out to everybody that it lists that his destination is 89 Mulberry Street.
Correct.
Just since you have it right there, going to be with his brother Giuseppe.
His older brother, and he's traveling into the United States with his older sister, Maria. That's great. And then we go to the next and final clue, which solves the puzzle. So you can go into the building file at the Municipal Archive, which is an amazing archive, that they actually have construction alterations that had to be filed for a certain amount of the addresses in Manhattan. And it goes back to the 19th century, which is just amazing to think about. So these are the actual originals of them. And you find that there was an alteration done to 53 Spring Street in 1912. I think it was the summer, actually. which says that they had an easement that they had to make, and they had to modify the windows and the basement staircase, which at the time I thought, well, that's really interesting, because I thought, and it wasn't immediate, I just thought, oh, I wonder if that affects how we can date the photograph. So one thing led to another, and it went into the order that I actually found a real estate appraisal photograph from the summer of the 1933. We're lucky in the case of Spring Street in the fact that there was a famous rich family that owned 53 Spring Street called the Wendell family. And since they donated a bunch of money to Drew University in Jersey, they also donated all their papers, which means all the rental books are in the archive. And it also means all the appraisals for all their properties when they all died out in the 30s are all in the archives there. So they had a photograph of the summer of 33, and you can see that aperture of the staircase right by the window there on the left-hand side. That is the modified opening to the staircase. Now, if you could go back to the original, you see how different that is. That's right by the staircase, and it's much, much bigger. And the windows are totally different too. The staircase is jutting out. You go here, and you see the staircase is now flush. The windows are different, and the staircase down to the basement is in a totally different space. Subsequent to this photo being found, I actually found the architectural plans which overlay the existing structure with the modification. So most of these things, you're not absolutely certain of things, but I'm absolutely certain that photograph, that's the famous photograph of Gennaro Lombardi and Antonio Pero, was photographed on or before the 1912, which given our 3 years, leaves us with only 1 year that makes any sense at all, and that's 1908. So what we're probably seeing in the famous photograph is when Gennaro Lombardi first takes over the business in the fall of 1908. And what's curious about this is that he's never in a city directory. So remember again, I found that Francisco Dorico in the 1910 business directory. I didn't find Gennaro Lombardi. So this is where the story, and we need to be very careful on the findings of fact here, but it's unusual in that what happened was Gennaro Lombardi had 53 Spring in the fall of the 1908, and then within months, if not weeks, or even days for all I know, before the spring of 1909, when Francisco Dorico is actually in the directory as the owner, Gennaro Lombardi sells the pizzeria to Francisco Dorico. And Francisco Dorico has it for the next 10 years or so, and then sells it back to Gennaro Lombardi, which starts then the tenure of the Lombardi family as the owners of 53.5 Spring Street.
Well, the owners of the business at 53.5 Spring Street.
Correct. That's an important distinction, because then the next thing to ask is a fun thing, is actually who owned the building, because the story had been not only that they had the first licensed pizzeria in 05, but they at the same time, or roughly there around the same time, the Lombardi family actually bought the building. So the natural thing is to research the building, which I did. And when you research the building, you find something very, very interesting. So that's the building now, or at least it was the building when I first was in New York the last time, which is about a year ago, unfortunately, and Gatsby's was still in business. Scott found out that they have since closed, unfortunately. But anyway, who owned the building? So that's the thing to ask. And when was the building actually constructed? So what you find is a very intriguing story. The building was built sort of in parts, but we're going to say the front 3 stories of that brick building that you see in front of you were built in 1821. And the curious thing about it, it wasn't 53 Spring Street at the time, it was 47 Spring Street at the time. And what the ad that was selling the building said, that it was built in a day's work, which I don't know how they interpreted it at the time, but it would be amazing if they can construct a 3-story brick building in a day's work. But you have these characters involved as to who owns. So it was originally, before it was constructed in 1821, the guy John Telfair bought the property, and on the property was a frame building, a stable, and a workshop in the rear. He's the one, John Telfair, who builds the three-story building in 1821, has it for a time, gets into financial difficulty, and then by 1829, a man by the name of Elias Lynch buys the building and the property. Elias Lynch was a grocer on Orange Street, which was right around the corner. It's changed the names, but then he becomes a postal official. He's an intriguing guy because he's a bit of a mathematician too. So he's actually published the papers in the journals at the time. So anyway, he has it for a considerable amount of time. And he has it in 1848, which, given the development of the street and the block and that whole area there, the address then changes significantly to 53 Spring Street in 1848. By 1855, he sells the building to the Corporation of New York City, which makes it the 14th Ward Police Station. During the time that the city of New York has it, they have it for about 1855, I guess, to 1879. It is a police station. They sell the building to the Wendell family in 1879, and then it becomes the building. And so you get the renters there. It was a boarding house in the early 1880s in the back, so significantly enough, I almost forgot to say, in 1862, the city of New York did considerable remodeling of the building, which is two main things. One, they added a fourth floor in the front, and in the rear, they built a three-story building. I speculate that might have been a jailhouse. I don't know that for a fact, but it's a big police station if they had it, because it's actually a big, the building if you go far enough and back. So anyway, by the 1880s, you have it as the building. But the curious thing about the fourth floor, when I was doing the research, I was looking at insurance maps and I couldn't make sense of it because I knew this had to be a four-story building brick, and I was seeing a three-story building brick. And I said this out loud to an archivist. So whenever I had a problem, I'd like to talk to people about it because invariably someone has somewhere in their brain that they know something that I don't know. In fact, it happens all the time. So this archivist says all the time, well, that happens all the time that they would add on another floor. I said, really? That's sort of astonishing. See, not a problem. So then I thought, well, I'm going to go look at the facade now of 53 Spring Street and see if I can see anything. And if you see it, look closely. So this is the top floor, the fourth floor. If you see my cursor here, this is the old 1829 brick, and this is the old but newer 1862, the brick up here. And then you can see up here at the very, very top, it goes back to the old brick. So you can actually see it. I don't know if this comes across on the screen, but I can clearly see a difference between the bricks here and the bricks up here and up here, and then it changes back up here. Anyway, I thought that was a fun thing to see. So that's the evidence as to who owned the building. If I go back here, I don't want to forget, the Wendell family had it from 1879. The last member of the family died off in the 1930s. The estate had it in the 1930s. And eventually, the Lombardi family, although if you look on the papers, it's interesting, Gennaro Lombardi didn't actually buy the building. His wife, Filomena Bellucci, in her name, with I think their family's address in Brooklyn, interesting enough, was on the mortgage.
The Roebling address, I think.
Exactly. So they bought that in the 1939. And a fun fact, you just get these, you don't expect to find these things, but the Wendell family was a very quirky family. They never married, so they died out with no descendants. They never sold any property at all. And one more curious thing about the family, they never would allow electric signs. So if you go back and look at the old pizzeria photographs, you'll never see before 1939 an electric sign. It was only after the Lombardis bought the building that virtually immediately in the early 40s, I think it was, that they put in an electrical sign.
Yeah, I love that because when you're looking through the folder, the 53 Spring folder, and you see that, it's like right after they buy the building.
Yeah.
It's their first it's us. Which is probably, this is another question. It's called Pizzeria Napoletana, Grande Pizzeria. When do you think is the first time that they put their name on the business?
I think it was after they bought the business. So we still see that in the article from Encore magazine. I think it was, they were still calling it Grande Pizzeria in Garden something or another. It was never really Lombardi's before they bought the building. So
That's exactly the point. Yeah, it seems like it's not until they buy it and they can put up signage and there you go.
yeah, and I think the times had changed because at that point, those early years from the late 19th century until about the 30s, you would only pretty much have Pizzeria Napolitanas. It was not Gennaro's Pizza or Giovanni's Pizza or Sal's or something like that. It was always much more defined and formal Pizzeria Napolitana, Bella Napoli, or something of the sort. You wouldn't really find names of the proprietors on the title of the business.
But they certainly put their names in advertisements.
Yes, they did do that.
So I mean, it could be, it's possible that on the street, it was, all these places were referred to by the name of the proprietor. It's like one of those things we just.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So just to bring us back into up to speed about this, this is 53 Spring Street, 53 and a half Spring Street, a building which housed Lombardi's. There's a famous photo that we now know was not taken in 1905, as was the label and the thought on it, taken in 1908, which has been deduced basically because had the alteration on the stairs happened in 1915, we wouldn't be able to have that date quite so solid on there. Had Gennaro Lombardi arrived in New York prior to 1903, that would have been harder to do, but there you go. Lots of bits of information that lead to some facts in the story. So 53 Spring Street, is there anything else we should talk about with this building, or is that it?
I think that's it for now for the building. I think we should plow ahead to actually who owned that store that you see in Gatsby's there, but that's the key thing. So the building is fine. So we can say that the Lombardi story that came through the decades, they did not buy it before the 1939. But that doesn't answer the question as to who was actually owning the pizzeria first and who actually had it and when did Gennaro Lombardi take over and what went on. So that's the next big thing. In fact, that's even more important than the property. So let's go further than that. And so you look in the city directories, and that's the sort of the best general guide to who owned the business. And so there's little tricks to use to find out. You don't have to go through every name in a 1,000-page directory, of course, but there's tricks to search by addresses, depending on what the website you're on, to search by address. So I found these relatively early of these names up here and the dates that they're involved in. And, you just immediately see. So before 1898, you don't see a restaurateur or a grocer like the story had been. It was a bank, it was a school in the 1890s. But the first name you do see is Tommaso Brabanti, 1898. He actually starts advertising in the summer of 1897. It's important to know that these directories, there's two different types, but they're canvassed. The business one is canvassed in the spring of that year, and the general one is canvassed in May and June of that year. So when we see that name, so in some of the directories it has him as a restaurant, so it's a little bit ambiguous. Maybe he was the original guy who served a pizza. We'll need more information on that. But anyway, you see this sequence of names throughout the years then at this same store at 53 Spring Street. So you see Meloni, you see Morel, you see Santillo, you see Pereira, Santulli, Uzdansky, Amalbi, Lombardi, and Dorico. So you see all these names, and of course, with all the names in a directory, they would associate it with what they're actually doing in the directory. So you probably had American canvassers going into Italian-American communities, trying to get their spelling of the last name right, trying to get the address right, but they almost always got the address right, and trying to get what they did. But when we look at all this data, it's a little confusing because sometimes it's called a grocery, sometimes they're making pies, sometimes it's a restaurant, sometimes with Meloni, it's a deli, a grocer, and a bakery. Santillo, it's a pie baker, a restaurant, and he's making candy in '08. So you get all these confusing things happening. And this is sort of typical originally. So this takes you a step, a big step, because it gets you the names and it gets you the time, the periods that they were associated with that store as the owner of the store. But it still leaves you with confusion as to what they were actually doing. Nowhere on this list does it actually say pizzeria. They only say baker or restaurant or grocery or candy or something akin to that. The closest it gets, it says pies, which is intriguing because what's a pie then? So we need more information is basically what we have. And we plow back on to say Italian American, the newspaper. So with a lot of searching, we see the first advertisement that Brabante has, and we get some more crucial detail of what he was actually doing at 53.5 Spring Street in the summer of 1897. So in this Italian American paper that was published in New York City, we learned exactly what he was doing. It was a pastry shop made for baptisms and weddings, and also sold the ice cream. Nowhere in here does it say anything about a pizzeria at all. So given what I know now about what the ads would have been, they would have screamed pizzeria if they would have had an ad. It's also interesting, it doesn't say this in this particular ad, but in a later ad for Brabante, this was actually a branch of his. He actually had his main pastry coffee house in Italian Harlem. And he was using this as a bit of an outpost, a little bit of a curious situation, but he ends up just being there for 1 year. So it starts in August, and that's key, that he started in the summer of 1897, because we're going to see some interesting things happen in the summer of 1898. So we found Santillo's ad, and when I found this is like, Scott, you would know this. This is like the perfect ad. It can't be any better. It has a sketch. It has the name of the business. It has the proprietor's name. It describes what he did exactly at the address that we want. It's an Italian American, the paper. This particular advertisement is in March of '05, but crucially, his ads of Santillo's ads for the pizzeria start in August of '04, which, as you know, is before Gennaro Lombardi actually came to the United States in November of '04. So I found this ad, I think, in like 2012 or 2013. And I saw a glimpse of it, and I knew immediately it said pizzeria, which anything you see in a paper about that is just gold. And I think I said a quick prayer, like, please be it, because by that point, I had been through like up and down, like I thought I understood the story, but I really didn't, because I didn't have anything really absolutely definitive. This was the definitive piece. I found this, and it was like the perfect time to find the ad, the perfect description. And if you get into the translation, it's got a very intriguing thing in it. And it says, after it says he's the proprietor and he just did a remodeling of the shop, it said Santillo being a pizza maker truly from Naples, who was in one of Naples' main pizzerias for a long time. Now that just adds to the valuableness of this ad. It can't get any better, but it does. In fact, if you see the vertical text on it, it says our specialty is, quote, stuffed pizza. And now I'm thinking this is a forgery. This can't be true, because how does the archetypical New York pizzeria have something that normally people now associate with deep dish Chicago or Chicago stuffed the pizza? It just is mind-boggling. So I don't know what more to say about that. It's just an awesome ad. And it solved the problem for me substantially. So it's got the oven in it. It's got him putting a pizza. I mean, it's a primitive ad. It's a primitive sketch, but it doesn't matter. It's got everything that you could possibly need in an ad.
Hey,
and
Peter.
So the next thing is to find who is Giovanni Santillo. And also, were any of the men who owned it before Santillo, were they the owners? Did they start the pizzeria at that point? So we know for sure it was a pizzeria before Lombardi. Was there someone before who was in the city directory that actually started it before Santillo? So you got to go through more information and more papers, and you come to this. And this is Filippo Meloni. This is a May of '03 ad. This is at a different address, but just having his name, again, it's a beautiful ad. It's not only an ad, but they blurbed it in the same edition of the paper when the first ad was started in the paper. And again, it has something very, very, very intriguing. The writer or the reporter or the publisher of the paper publishes Meloni's ad, which probably he had a lot of the help with. But he says something very intriguing in the blurb for the ad. So not in the actual ad, but the publisher put something in the blurb. And he said, reputation for those who have been to Naples and the Pizzeria Portable, formerly Salsiccia, may well remember Meloni's specialties that can now be enjoyed in, and that's got the block there for me. But he words that in a teasingly, tantalizingly clever way. He doesn't come out and say that Meloni worked in that Pizzeria Portable, but he says, you may well remember his specialties that can now be enjoyed if you went to the Pizzeria Portable. So it implies it gets you about 75% of the way there and imply that he actually worked at the Pizzeria Portable, but he doesn't explicitly say that. So it's a big tease. I still don't know to this day if he actually worked there. I know pretty much he probably wasn't the owner of it, which is fine. But anyway, it just adds to the intrigue. Who was Meloni became an obsession, and where else did he work? So part of the issue with all the research is if you can't solve the specific problem, you expand the problem. So then it's the question of not what did Meloni do at Spring Street between 1898 and the 1900, but what was his entire career or his entire life? What did he do for a business? So then you ask that and you look into his life and you get this. So this is Filippo Meloni's 11 business career from 1892 to his death in 1924. An incredible career. The only man that I've ever seen go to this many addresses in a long career, but we still don't have all his years, but to have 11 different addresses moving around so much, especially initially. And I don't even know if I've got them all up here, but so he starts out in Italian Harlem, which you think we came, and we're not absolutely sure, but we think he came in 1892. But he's in the Upper East Side. And the first indication that we actually have is a record of him under his exact name buying a horse and carriage, which is interesting. And then right there afterwards, he's in the general directory owning, and I didn't put it in here, but it said in eating house, which is just a synonym for a restaurant. He has it for a brief time. He's only in there until the next directory comes along in the spring of 1895. He's gone. So the next time he looks to come up in Brooklyn in 1896, and he's donated to a charity with other proprietors. It doesn't say he's a proprietor of a business, but it implies it. And the first time we actually see him in a directory again is in Brooklyn in 1898, and he's at 47 Union running a restaurant. And those two dates are extremely important to me because it's before he comes to Spring Street. And the Spring Street, it's never describing him as a restaurant. It's toyingly saying he's a baker, it's a deli. Some said he was a grocer. It's not saying specifically a restaurant or certainly a pizzeria, but he does one extremely important thing. In the summer of 1898, suddenly we get a building permit. And that building permit, and we think it's Meloni who's doing the request for the permit, they're installing a baker's oven in the summer of 1898, right when he is taking over. So then the question is, okay, that makes sense because he's a baker. That makes sense also because the previous owner did not look to be making baking things to that specific spot. So why was he so gung-ho on getting a baker's oven in 53 Spring Street? What was he making in there? And that's why we can't say with absolute certainty that he was the starting guy who actually started the pizzeria, the business at Spring Street. But I would say it's more probable than not. I would say it's very probable almost. I wouldn't say it's highly probable, but somewhere between 80 and 90%, I would say that he's the one who started it. Just given his entire career. So if you fast forward just a year or so, by 1901, we have verified 100% that he's in an ad for a pizzeria. He then goes on, and everything that you see in green is a new address that he's starting a pizzeria. So he starts, I've counted at least 6 of them if you include Spring Street. I think there's undoubtedly more there. So I suspect strongly that the ones in Italian Harlem and on Union Street were pizzerias too. Yeah, just an amazing career. We don't know if he was the first guy to make the pizzeria the business in the United States official, but certainly 1894 May, it's pretty early. It's not the earliest one that we have on record, but just because we don't see it on record doesn't mean he wasn't there earlier. So he dies in the back of a taxi cab in 1924. Right before then, he goes back to Italy. So I've actually gone back and hired some professional help that found his birth, the record. He was born in Piano di Sorrento in 1862. He got married in 1882. It's not 100%, but he looks to have come, given everything that we know, in 1892 to America. And then the only year he goes back to Italy is 1923. There are still things about his life in the United States we don't know. We don't know his career from about 1913 to the beginning of 1915. But the other intriguing thing about his career too is that Spring Street is still around in a form, not at the same address, not with the same owners, obviously, but they're still around, and John's of the Bleecker is still around. And Meloni was, at least what we can say, heavily involved in the early years at the very least of both of those spots. And also he was, by the way, I almost forgot, he started Pops, which was at 120 the Van Brunt at about 1906, and that was there for until the 1950s.
Peter, I just want to interject for a second, and just to clarify for everybody watching that Peter just mentioned, Lombardi's 53 Spring Street, and Meloni very likely being the person who instigated the construction of the oven, and very likely making pizza there, which we can assume because everything he did after that has links to pizza. But when Peter referred to John's of Bleecker Street, currently on Bleecker Street, its original locations, and it's had 3, its original location was 175 Sullivan, which is the column all the way to the right of this chart. That eventually became a partner with John Sasso. Definitely that became the pizzeria that evolved into John's Pizzeria.
Yeah, and just a thought on that one, the original name of the pizzeria at 175 Sullivan was Pizzeria Portalba, which, if you harken back to the 03 pizzeria that Meloni had, he called it Pizzeria Portalba. And you go back to the blurb, said he had his specialties like the Pizzeria Portalba. So this Pizzeria Portalba was like the Rays of the 19 teens. It's just an amazing name. You see it pop up from time to time. And we still don't understand the whole thing of it, but it's very intriguing.
Yeah, I've been looking into that a bit. There is 165 Bleecker was a new Port Alba. So just like famous Rays, original Rays, they were like different versions of that name.
And also at McDougal called it the original.
Yeah.
Portalba. And then when, I don't know if we got to this point, but I forgot to say that Agostino Pereira, did I get to this point?
We haven't talked about Pereira yet.
Yeah, so if we go back quickly, Agostino Pereira is a very intriguing guy. He was originally from Stromboli, which is an island. He was a sailor. He looks to have been in the Red Hook area where Meloni had strong ties. Anyway, Agostino Pereira is in the directory when Centillo was not, between '04 and '06. We know that Centillo with his wife goes back to Naples between '06 and '07, and then comes back in October of '07. And then starts up the pizzeria again. And so the story I got, and I tracked down through a long chain of names, through marriage, the descendants of Agostino Pereira, and I'm proud to say, I hope that one of the descendants is in the audience now. Agostino Pereira thought he actually owned the pizzeria when Centillo went back to Italy. Centillo comes back, and this is not uncommon for any sort of the business. I don't think it was in writing probably, but Centillo took the business back from Pereira. Pereira then leaves literally almost immediately because Centillo comes back in October of '07, and Pereira, right across the street at 50 Spring in February of 1908, opens up his pizzeria. And what does he call it? He's calling it Pizzeria Potalba. He only has it for like a year and a half, but as I was just sort of thinking about it last night in preparation for this talk, and I talked to Scott about it, at that time, Centillo didn't know how long Pereira would be in the business in competition with him right across the street, which has to be enormously annoying. And they were, I mean, I can't see them being friends at this point. What you see afterwards is this gets into the change of ownership. Giovanni Centillo in the '08 directory, in the general one, so this was canvassed as of May, June of the 1908, he changes the business. Instead of being a grocer or a baker or a restaurant, now he's saying he's into candy, which leads me to believe that if there's something wrong with him physically, maybe he can't take it, or the pizzeria is just not successful at this point. I don't think you change business, the models like that if you're a success. But anyway, this gets into the change, and then Pereira opens up in competition. What you're seeing then is Centillo selling the business to Gennaro Lombardi in the fall, or maybe even the late summer of '08. And the only proof that we have of that is the photo. Gennaro Lombardi, again, is never in the directory before 19. So anyway, that's just a fun thing. And you get into oddities of how the directory is constructed. Sometimes it's giving false data, but that's the best guess as to what actually happened, that Centillo sells the business, goes back to Italy, which, by the way, had been the Lombardi family story. He bought it from the old man who went back to Italy, and he was paying him back for a long time. And then we can take it forward from there. So we get that.
Yeah, I'd love to know some more about some of these other, you have all these other pizzerias listed, and I know we want to get to one specifically in Brooklyn.
Yeah, so I want to highlight Francisco Dorico just because all these guys are intriguing and you want to know as much about them. But of the guys in the list here, Meloni is extremely important, obviously, because I think he started the business here, and he was involved in so many, and that led to so many other ones. So he's almost, you would say, if you had to pick a central guy in the United States with the pizza business, he's your man. Now, it's complicated because there are many families, and a lot of people were doing things that were not even probably in contact with him. But okay, so if you had to pick the three central guys, it would be Meloni, Lombardi, and Francisco Dorico. Francisco Dorico was related to marriage to the Lombardi family. And let me just go through why I think Francisco Dorico is so important. So the significance of his career, he comes in, I think if I remember right, 1902 to America. He comes as a baker, so he was involved in the baking, the business, right in a sort of a northern town of the Naples area. So I'll just tick off why I think he's significant. I believe, and this coincides with the Lombardi family story, that he taught Gennaro Lombardi, who, by the way, came in '04 as a laborer. So there's no indication that Gennaro Lombardi, as a 17-year-old, had any prior experience in the bakery, the business. So when the Lombardi story was transmitted then in the 80s and the 90s, he refers, or the family refers to, he was taught in a Brooklyn bakery. I believe that man who taught him was Francisco Dorico, who was related to him by marriage. And I believe the time, the period would have been '05 to '07 in a Brooklyn bakery in Williamsburg. The other thing he does is that he also taught at Spring Street Ferdinando Romano and Salvador Baresca in about the 1910, the 1912, the period. And I just found this out at the last trip. He actually leased 120 Van Brunt, which eventually becomes, in the later years, Pop's Pizzeria, to Romano and Baresca. I don't know why I mean, I assume he subleased it to them because they end up buying the building in the 15. But Dorico's involved in that one too. He also, and I think this is intriguing too, at a critical time when the business looks to be kind of faltering, and I don't know if it would have survived, he was the guy who stabilized the business after Santillo left, after Lombardi left. And he got the business in at least by the spring of '09. And between those early years, he brings his brother, who would also come. It was an older brother, Tamaro. And one of the really exciting finds, I can still remember exactly when, these are always problems to find because if you're not an owner, you're not going to be in a directory. So it was always a problem to see who Tamaro Dorico was and where he was. But if you start to widen your search of the family again, I searched his wife's manifest, and Teresa Margarita came, and I think it was 1911. And where is she going? She's going to her husband, Tamaro Dorico, at 53.5 Spring Street. And at that time, Francisco was the owner. And that coincides with their family story too, that Tamaro Dorico and Francisco Dorico were both at the Spring Street location, with Francisco Dorico, the head of it.
Hey, Peter,
yes,
can I
sir.
ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Just because we have a train of conversation happening in the chat that I want to bring up because it's a really good question.
Okay, sure.
We know Gennaro Lombardi married Filomena Bellucci in 1910.
Right.
We know that her family were bakers. Is there any possibility that Gennaro Lombardi learned baking from her family?
I'm sure he learned some things. I don't know to what degree they did. I think it's important, though, to go back to that family story and who the original tie. And first of all, it's the Dorico family story that they taught Gennaro Lombardi the baking career, that they taught him how to make a pizza. Also, I don't know how long he courted Filomena for, but it's pretty early that the Lombardi story was that he started in the business right off he came off the boat. He was living above the pizzeria, getting free board there because he worked there, and then he would go to Brooklyn to work nights at the Brooklyn bakery. Well, that fits in perfectly with Francisco Dorico's career. There's also the Dorico story that was told, at least by, it came down. So it's a family story, which has got all the good parts and the bad parts of it, that Francisco Dorico was the godfather of Gennaro Lombardi. So, I mean, it's possible the both were. I believe with the timing of it, it's so early in his career and it coincides so well with the family story. You could say that in '05 and '06, he somehow had a tie to the Bellucci family that we don't know about. But we know absolutely that the Doricos, already before they got off the boat, had a direct tie to the Lombardi family through the Dorico sisters.
Sure. Yeah, that is established earlier. All we know about the Bellucci Lombardi thing is that they live around the corner from each other and that they get married in 1910 and that her family are all bakers in Williamsburg and eventually some of them own pizzerias.
Correct, right.
And that question was brought up by an likely unrelated Andrew Bellucci, who's
I knew it was
right now, who is in a big part responsible for Lombardi's reopening in 1994.
It's great to have him here.
Yeah.
Let me plow ahead because that last point of Tamaro Dorico then opens up the first pizzeria in New Jersey. And I'm saying,
hold on a second, Peter. What year is this photo taken that we're looking at?
Okay, so yeah, so this is the pizzeria of Francisco Dorico. We don't know exactly, but he had this pizzeria starting in 1930 about, and he had it for 2 or 3 years, I believe, if my memory's right.
Early 1930s.
Yeah, eventually it gets into the hands of Ferdinando Romano, his good friend. So that goes, and Romano's family had that until, I don't know when they closed it, but it was there, at least on Google, the pictures, until the 2000s.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, yeah, so that's the side. It's 7117 13th Avenue. Uh, Not that far away from where Lombardi lived.
Yeah, interesting.
So anyway, so
Lombardi moved from Williamsburg down to Diker Heights, down to deeper.
yeah, exactly. And so the headline here of this whole thing, though, is how did the pizza business spread to Jersey? And it spread because of the Dorico brothers. And I believe it spread, and we have this on both sides of the Dorico family, that Tamaro Dorico, the older brother, was working at Spring Street with Francisco Dorico, the owner of 53.5 Spring Street, in 1910, and still there for several years. We don't know why he left, but there's a family story that there was a fight between the brothers, and it may have been a physical fight. And we have this strange thing happening. Now, it's a perfect example here. We just have the manifest and when they were in the directories and the stories of the families. And so it's hard to put cause and effect together. But there are interesting things that happen. Francisco Dorico, for a reason that I don't know of, goes alone back to Italy in early the 1914. He lives, his wife and his large family. He's got, I think at that point, he's probably got 7 or 8 kids, at least, maybe even more, at Spring Street, which is not something that you would do, just leave your wife alone and just leave her. And why did he go? He was only there for a short time, so he comes right back, but we don't know what happened or why he left. He wasn't even a citizen at the time, so didn't really take any risks there, but it's a little of a ballsy the move to do. So my speculation is the brother Tamaro ran the pizzeria at that time and took care of both families at that time. Francisco comes back, and what do we see? Near after he comes back in the 1914 Trenton directory, all of a sudden you see Tamaro Dorico there. He's a potter for whatever reason. Then the next year, in the 1915 Trenton directory, he's listed for the first time as a baker. Now again, it doesn't say he owns a pizzeria, but it says baker, and anytime it says baker, you're sort of in the red zone. You're sort of in, okay, you need to look very closely because that's possible, if not probable, given the family story, he started the pizzeria at that time. But we can say definitely because he's in an Italian-American paper by 1920, it is a pizzeria napolitana. So this is sort of the news here. That's never been publicized before. And there's been intimations, if you read between the lines, I think the families knew, but they didn't know the specifics of the story. And the next page will show who the brothers are. So this is really an exciting page because obviously I'm saying the fight between the brothers at Spring Street when Francisco Dorico came back led Tamaro Dorico to leave Spring Street and go to Trenton to eventually, if not almost immediately, open up a pizzeria there. That is the only picture of Tamaro Dorico that the families know exists. I don't know of any other way of getting it but through the families. And it took a super long time and a heroic effort by some specific, the members of the Dorico and the Bianchi family to find this absolutely great photo of Tamaro. That was probably, I mean, obviously that's done later in life. He dies in the mid to early 40s. The thing that's interesting about it is that's Joe's Italian tomato pies right in the center of the building below at 5050 South the Clinton. That's an example of a tax photograph for Trenton. This is probably in the 1930s. And what's interesting about it is that sign in back of Tamaro Dorico says Joe's Italian tomato pies. That's the exact sign that's on the building there.
So awesome.
What happened was they just remodeled the whole thing, which I suspect probably happened in the late 30s, early 40s. So those are the two brothers, not at the same time, obviously, but yeah. I mean, I have to tell the story of the photograph. That was plucked out of the Trentoniana archive of the Trenton Free the Public, the library, by, I think her last name was Nardi, if I'm right. She was a real archivist type, and she told me the story that she discovered all this collection of text photography. They were dumping it in a dumpster, and she jumped in the dumpster and she plucked these, what would have been thousands of photographs out. So if we didn't have her, we wouldn't have had the photograph. These are the only photographs that I know of Joe's. So that both of these, the photographs are the only known ones to exist of that
Peter,
time.
when did Joe's open and when did Joe's close?
So it's a little bit complicated. If you go through the directories, we know he was a baker in the 1915. This is Dorico. So that's
Dorico.
Tomorrow Dorico, correct. We know he was, I think if I go back to the 1913s, he was at Spring Street still. I suspect by the 1914s, he was still there. We know he starts as a baker in the 1915s. So about that would be the soonest that I would think. It doesn't seem to be continuous. They move a lot. It goes to his son-in-law, Pietro Silvestro, which Joe is Joe Silvestro. That's who they name it after. The Silvestro brothers run the thing from, I don't know the exact dates, but certainly in the 30s to the 40s to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I think they closed, if my memory is right, sometime in the 90s. And they had enormously a good run. But those early years, I haven't established that it was continuous. I suspect it was rather they stopped and started, and then they got going in the 30s and they had it continuously.
I should also say that we have some Silvestros in the audience here.
Yeah, I'm happy to show them the photographs of this would have been, I think it's their great grandfather. Anyway, let's the plug on because I'm sure we're going to have a Q&A here. I still haven't even told you a significant fact of what's the first verified the pizzeria in America. This is a pure accident, an error by the canvasser who put down Pizzeria Forno E, which undoubtedly means he saw on a sign Forno E Pizzeria, which means oven and pizzeria. This is an error that they should never have done, but the man was probably assuming that that was the man's name that they had on a sign or on the window. It was not the name, it was the description of the business. It was at 5090 off Mulberry Street that no longer exists anymore because they made a park out of it in about 1895 to 1896. The interesting thing here about it is who was the proprietor. We know with pretty high degree certainty there was probably a sole proprietorship and the man's name was Giovanni Albano. And he had it from 1893 to 1895. They destroy the block because they're doing the park. He leaves New York City and goes to Springfield, Massachusetts, and opens up a grocer bakery, which never says it's a pizzeria, but given his history, it's highly probable that by the turn of the century, he's doing the same thing in Springfield. The other very interesting thing about that, it's not only what Santilli said in his ad that he was in a famous pizzeria as a worker, as a doer, but Giovanni Albano, we know, or at least we're pretty sure that he was owner of a pizzeria in Naples, Italy in 1889 before he came to America. So I don't know about you, Scott, but the story is I had always heard in the 2000s that when they brought pizza to America, it was farmers, it was the customers, it was never really the actual makers and people of the Naples who did this. It was more the consumers who might have done it. They weren't. The thing that was always explained to me is that why would you leave Naples, where you're a superstar if you're an owner of a pizzeria, to come to America, which had nothing? You would have to reestablish the whole business. And there's probably the truth to that. The issue is that there's so many people who had pizzerias at that time that it only takes a couple to start the ball rolling. And this is a significant thing that happened, but given the fact that they destroyed the block And there was no continuity between this and Spring Street, or there's no obvious continuity between it. So, but I do have a picture of that block that I'm going to show you with some very intriguing things to it. Scott, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just to clarify for everybody. So there have been people asking, oh, well, if this Lombardi's at 53 Spring Street 1905 story is not the whole thing, then was Meloni the first pizzeria in America? And this here is evidence of something before that, back in 1894, potentially 1893, or maybe even earlier. So just want to clarify that for everybody.
Right. And so the way to express it is that this is the first direct evidence that there was pizzeria. There's circumstantial evidence that you can go further back, but it's just circumstantial. But this actually shows it. So it's this is the one in the book that's going to say, so if you had to say what year was the first verified pizzeria in America, it was verified in the spring of 1894, which is a little bit significant because it's shortly before Meloni had his restaurant in Italian Harlem. Anyway, I want to show you a picture that's exciting, that's intriguing, and it's one of those that it's like, oh, what was going on there? And
Great. I want to also let everybody know that there are questions piling up in the chat, and I want to encourage you to ask them. We will get to those right after Peter shows us a couple more pictures. I just want to let everybody know I absolutely want to get those in here, because if somebody watches this video later, they won't know about what's going on in the chat. So I want to bring it up and Peter have you say something. So let's go through these couple photos and then we'll do some Q&A.
Right, so here's a photograph of Mulberry Street, and the west side is the one that got destroyed in 1895. That whole block gets leveled and there's a park there now. 59.5 Mulberry Street is right where my cursor is, right here. It's not this one, so this is 59 here, this is 57. 59 is this sliver of a building right here. It's a 5-story one right here. And what I just found, I mean, it's incredible. I've been working on this story for almost 10 years. Actually discovered this name of the restaurant in a bus. Anyway, for the first time, just about a month ago, I discovered, and I immediately texted Scott, that there was a basement in 59.5 the Mulberry Street, which simplifies who was what where. Anyway, the bottom line of the story, this was in a book in 1890. So it was published, this photograph was published in 1890, which means on or before that year, the photograph had to have been taken. Now that's a little early for the pizzeria. There was a bakery before Albano came there. And we think it was on the first floor, not in the basement. We think there was a saloon in the basement. So we think Albano eventually takes over the bakery in 1893. The bakery had been there for 2 years before then, but this is even before the bakery was there. So there was a restaurant and a saloon there. I don't think it was a pizzeria at this time, but given the culture and the people from this block area, it was a Neapolitan part of town. So remember, it's an important fact that this is so early that people were living in the same regions of Italy, maybe in the same towns. They were living very close together. So the fact that there was a pizzeria here in 1893 is a logical assumption that there were customers. Who would the customers have been? They would have been people from the Campania, the region, and Naples. I stared at this photo in preparation for a trip. I think it was 2013 or so. And there's a couple of versions of this photograph taken almost at the same angle. But you're looking at the photograph and what strikes you is the beauty of the sweep of the street and the people and their dress. But I started focusing on it, and you've got this guy in the middle of the street with a wheelbarrow, and we want to take a closer look at what's going on there. And so you look at that and you think, what's that object in the wheelbarrow? And that looks to be a bell. And what's he doing? And Scott, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. So it's likely a food storage container. And since there's a bell, it's almost certainly a food vendor. And there's an object that looks exactly like this. that was used to carry pizzas around the streets of Naples and probably New York, called a stufa or a stove, which is a copper cylinder with a little vented top to allow out steam, which Peter thinks that this very well could be. And since it seems like this picture is taken in the fall, we had talked about how pizza makers were sort of like a seasonal business for street walking on the streets. It certainly could be that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, we don't know what's in there, but it's very similar to a shape that would have been a stufa-like, where you actually have a lid on that thing. You look to have side handles on that thing. Sometimes, in fact, well, the stories had been that they would carry them around on top of their head. The stories were in Chicago, and undoubtedly they were in all or major Italian-American communities at that time. I cannot conceive, I mean, the easiest the business to go into is to peddle things. If you were to make the pizzas, you could have fried them up. You didn't even have to have an oven up, but you could have gone into an oven that they had, but it was a German baker, but he rented out the oven for 5 cents or something like that. Whatever. There's a number of different ways to do it. It's the simplest business to do. So I think the people who first started the pizzeria, the business in America, probably were peddlers. I don't know what's in there, but it is very, very interesting. And it would, I don't know what are the odds, but I think 50-50 is not unreasonable to say that there are pizzas in that stufa there. Sound right, Scott, or no?
I'm not as convinced as you are.
Oh, no.
Well, we've talked about this. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. I still think it could be, I'm not totally convinced it's pizza. I want to believe it's pizza.
No, I'm not either. I'm just saying, given the neighborhood, given the shape of what he's doing, and given what we know about a stufa.
Right, but there were other foods carried in this kind of thing. What I want to know is what is between, by that area where the bell is, between him and the stufa. Are there containers? Is this something, could it have been ice cream, which we know was sold on the streets? I don't know. I mean, believe me, I want to believe that that's pizza, but every stufa that I've seen has a conical top.
Yeah.
With vents. And there could be vents on that little side piece, but again, it's sort of like, this to me is almost like you're looking at a picture and somebody says, oh, it's a spaceship, and somebody else says, oh, it's a weather balloon, and I don't know. You call it a UFO because it's unidentified.
It's unidentified, but definitely intriguing.
Absolutely.
Some more the photographs?
Yeah, let's take a look at a couple more because there are questions and I really want to get them.
Okay, so this is little Rockettes. This would have been near Times Square, and we know there were pizzerias in the late 30s in Times Square. We don't know exactly the dates. We know the names of the Rockettes, and I'm going to follow up on this. So this is still under active research now, but the main takeaway here is that pizza is starting to cross over into non-Italian communities. And one of the main conduits for that is the Broadway Times Square area, where you had that massive amount of people. And you had actors that were coming in from overseas and stuff. You had a lot of different cultures melting together. And pizza was sold in the mid to late 30s at that area, which is different than in other areas of Brooklyn and Manhattan. They were mainly confined in the outer regions to Italian-American communities until, I would say, the years of World War II. But anyway, it's a great photo. It's the pizza, and it reminds us of the pizzas that you could have right now in a coal oven and be delighted by. It looks awesome.
That's when you showed me this picture, my first thought is that pizza looks so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, and it's remember we talked about this, how it looks like topping is kind of half and half topping.
It does. It looks almost like, I mean, I wouldn't dare say it's a pepperoni at that stage because we all know that that's almost impossible, right? I'm being facetious there. It looks close to it.
Peter says that because we had a long conversation, I think, yesterday about the origin of pepperoni.
Yes. It just looks awesome. I can't wait to find out more about this. I have contacted the archives of the Rockettes and showed them this and asked them about it. It was in one of their exhibits, and they told me they don't have a record of it, unfortunately, and they have no idea. but that doesn't, it's just one thing to go through. We,
Hmm.
still go on. And this is a photograph that is completely different. So this was taken on the street at the corner of 112th and First Avenue, so Italian Harlem, in considerably earlier, 1928, July 16th. And that's a significant date because if that doesn't ring any bells for the audience, we know that's the Our Lady of Mount Carmel feast day. And so this particular street photographer would go up on the feast days and take the pictures of the celebration. And he was not Italian, so he probably had no clue what these guys were selling. But on the side of the negative, which I bought, it says Italian pies. And it's intriguing because of the size of them and because of lack of topping or minimal amount of topping on them and how they're sold. So we do have stories in the early 20th century that they would sell these sometimes small pies that were pizza-like with minimal toppings or no topping at all. So obviously they're made for an individual to be had on the street. So I just think it's an amazing photograph too.
I think it's also important to point out that the thing that we define as pizza today is more specific than the way that word was used 100 years ago. So Peter and I talked about pizza, pizzette, pizzelle. That word pizza is not super, super specific. It was really quite general.
But I mean, you're not implying that it's a sweet pie, I think it was a savory.
No. I'm just saying that to look at this and say, oh, they're stacked and I don't see cheese and tomato does not prevent them from being pizzas.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, and I'm just making an argument for that. Like, I think looking at this, somebody could say, oh, these guys are crazy. They just want these to be pizza because it's a cool old picture. They're just giant cookies or something. But like, no, there are tons of descriptions that talk about that thickness and there not being a risen cornicione and it being quite lightly topped. And I'm just saying that the thing that we define as pizza today is not the only thing.
But it could have been, undoubtedly this was made in one of those Italian Harlem, the bakeries. Totally. And it could have been in a bread bakery, but it could have been in one of them that were classified under a bakery, but actually were pizzerias. And this is what, could have been extremely small. And so this is what they could have been using as a major product for, what I'm saying is that just because you have a pizzeria there didn't mean that you have to have sit down, didn't mean you have to have the big hours that Lombardi's had. This could have been just sole proprietorship. He's making the pies out and they're peddled on the street. And if you come, they're for the people just to walk away with.
Sure. And also that selling pizza does not mean it's a pizzeria.
Yeah, well, that's another issue that we've talked about endlessly and we've killed that horse. But basically my 2 cents on this whole thing was, if you're making dough primarily for the purpose of making a pizza, then you're a pizzeria. If you're making dough primarily to make bread, but then have pizza as a side the product that you sometimes make, technically, yes, you're a pizzeria, but that's not investing in the pizzeria business. You're not committed to the pizzeria business. You're mainly in the bread of the business. So
the frustration of all this and kind of what keeps us going with looking into this is the fact that this boy in the center of the picture, who clearly works in that bakery, his family has a story of how great granddad worked in a bakery in East Harlem, and they know more about this picture than we do. They probably don't know that the picture exists.
Well, that's the beauty of the blog and these presentations and the people in the audience, because everyone has a little bit of different take on things, and especially the families who are there now, they have something in their brain that they might have a memory of. They might have a photograph, they might have a document, but especially a memory that they might not think is significant, but in the proper context can change everything. Yeah. And that's happened again and again to me, where I thought, after the second or third hour, I was like, okay, there's nothing to be said, but then bam, you get the story and it's a whopper and they don't even know it, because you have to have the context of the entire story, which is
why the oral history is so helpful. Even if not everything is factual,
exactly.
Elements of it give you enough. So
That's the
Peter,
summation.
are
Right.
you okay to answer a couple of questions that we have?
I will be here as long as you need me.
Great. I know people have been hanging out here for a while. It's an hour and a half of us talking about this, but I really want to go through some of these. First question comes from Andrew Bellucci, the pizza maker who inspired and brought about the reimagining and reopening of Lombardi's in the mid 90s. First of all, he says he's taken a DNA test to find out if he's related to the Bellucci's that married into the Lombardi family. Anyway, his question is, if Gennaro Lombardi was the owner of Lombardi's 53 Spring in 1908, why was he listed as a baker working on his own account, quote, his own account, in 1910? Own account meaning no employees, and he wasn't a proprietor.
Yeah, so this gets into the directories and how sometimes they're good, but just because you don't see them in a directory doesn't mean that they're not in the business. So we don't know what he was doing at that time. If it said, and I've talked to Andrew about this, if it said his own account, we have to go back to the definition specifically at that year to figure out exactly what they mean by that. But it could have been that he had a bread delivery, the business, so he didn't have employees, but he was in the bakery, the business in some capacity. We know eventually where he's living, and by the 1912 and the 1913 directories, he's living at the same spot in Williamsburg that Francisco Dorico was living at from 05 to 07. So it's very close to being the following. They flip the businesses.
Well, you're talking about North 5th Street?
Yeah, I'm talking about 234 North the 5th Street in Brooklyn. Francisco Dorico is living there, as we both found, Scott. They had an oven there. They had the business there. Well, actually, Francisco Dorico was selling the goods the next door, but the oven was in 234. He had that from 05 to 07, and then he leaves it. Lombardi then is living in 234, the North 5th, and he's got the business out of there, where the oven was. So the dates aren't exactly right, but sometimes the directories are not 100%. They do miss the businesses. And if you go back to see that building, it looks to be a cellar bakery, and it's probably changed considerably, but even in the tax photography, it didn't invite itself too much for being a business. So it's entirely possible they could have been doing bread, but it didn't present itself on the exterior as a business. So maybe they were delivering only. I don't know. But I mean, I think the key point is the directories show in 1912, 1913, Gennaro Lombardi had a bakery, the business, out of 230 North 5th in Brooklyn, the same spot that Francisco was living in and virtually selling his, whatever he sold, probably bread, maybe even pizza too, from 05 to the 1907. Then in 08 or 09, they flip, or at least it's seemingly they flip. So it's not exact, but it's very suggestive. It's very coincidental that they're both at each other's spot virtually at the same time.
It's funny that the gaps between the facts there's such deep crevices, but you just do the best you can and bring up as many facts as you can and fill up the story, which actually brings me to the next question. So, this is kind of a comment question from a couple of people. Daria Silvestro brings this up from the Silvestro family, Joe's Tomato Pie in Trenton. And she says, the family claims that in 1911 was the start date when they were selling newspaper wrapped pizzas from the basement, which is why Papa's used to call themselves the second oldest pizzeria in America before Joe's closed. But then Colin Kaplan in New Haven, who will be doing a very similar talk with me in 2 weeks about New Haven pizza history, mark your calendars, he brings up that, didn't they say Papa's claimed to have opened in 1912? And does this evidence refute that claim?
Yeah, so this is a good example of having people in the audience who are smart and know the stories. And that I'm very well aware of all these things. And this is another family stories that are true and some that are false. And I'm not prepared to say exactly what is true and false, but I'd like to talk to some of the families involved in this before I go to the public with them. But I'm very well aware of the Papa story. And, sometimes the stories tend to be right in the sense that my grandfather came and he did this at that spot. But timing is, it's almost every family has this same thing happen again and again. Timing is hard to get right. And what tends to happen, I found through multiple families, and this happened to Lombardi too, I think, the date of arrival or near the date of arrival when whoever it is starts to work in the business is near the date of arrival, that takes on an aura of itself, and that sort of becomes when he owned the business. So the two distinctions get lost when he came here and started working, which is dominant. That's the one that they always say, but the family story then ends up, that's when he actually owned the business.
Right. So what you're saying is, just to put it into the context of real names here, if Gennaro Lombardi comes in November 1904, 89 Mulberry, if he walked up the street, turned left, got a job at this bakery at 53 Spring in 1905, 2 months later, and started working there, maybe that's where the family starts saying, oh, he's been doing this since 1905, and maybe that becomes he owned it since 1905. Is that what you're saying? That
precisely.
Yeah, over time, it just sort of, it gets confused about working, owning, all that.
Now, to put that in perspective too, Scott, I'm never 100% on some of these stories, but the Lombardi ones I'm near 100% on. But I mean, I take very seriously each of the family stories because they challenge, even documents can be wrong and confusing. So it's good to be humble.
Well, yeah, it's never, none of this is about refuting or disproving something. It's more about bringing to light the stories and the names and the families that haven't been talked about. And when you get so excited about talking about how old something is, oh, isn't it interesting to find out that there was something 11 years before that? So we have there's a great comment that came up from Ernie saying about the picture of the peddler in the street with the bell on Mulberry Street with 59 and a half Mulberry. Yeah, let's bring it back. The comment is, I think it's very unlikely that the peddler walked that entire street ringing the bell and didn't sell anything. Maybe like looking closer at what's behind him will reveal what he was selling. I think it's a great comment. I mean, I know we've kind of probably looked at this a bunch, but who knows? There could be something in somebody's hand.
I don't get I see what you're saying. So
what if somebody behind him might be holding something that they bought from him?
Good point. Excellent.
Yeah.
I will go through that. I think that kid has it there. I see a pizza there. No, I don't know.
Yeah. Also, Peter, do you have a picture of a stufa handy?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Well,
I mean, don't worry if you don't have it handy. I have one against the wall, or if you stop sharing, I have one right here that I can share because I think Dominic Arviello is asking, what object on the card specifically indicates that it might be pizza? And I've got that picture of the boy walking around with the stufa handy if you want to see it.
Sure.
I think you just have to stop sharing your screen. If you can. Okay, so Dominic, I'll show you this. This is that object, or potentially that object. This is a stufa selling pizza. There it is. So that's what led Peter to think, oh, maybe this is pizza. Cool. Let's dig into some more of these. Let's see. Okay, let's see. There's a question about the first bakery of pizza that Francesco owned, where Gennaro learned how to bake the pizza and eventually go, oh, he's saying 236 North 5th Street, Brooklyn. Census records support this, as well as our family accounts. Yeah, I think that's just what we were just talking about, that 234 North 5th Street and 236 North 5th Street, directly next to each other. There was an oven at 234 North 5th Street. Peter, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, just making sure you're still there. Anyway, the oven, which we were at the Brooklyn Department of Buildings and found the iCard that had the oven on it, and it was a blissful day. But anyway, yeah, it sounds like that's maybe not the pizzeria, but certainly a bakery. And then Andrew Bellucci, are you there right now, Andrew Bellucci? I'm curious to bring you on because all I see is this. a comment that you said, you're guessing, that's not a fact. I don't remember what you're referring to because there have been a lot of comments in between. I think you're just talking about Gennaro Lombardi, I think the timeline, which is Gennaro Lombardi owning the business briefly in 1908. We only know that because of that photograph. And then we know he's in Williamsburg, Brooklyn after that. We're not sure exactly when, but within the year after that. So Andrew Bellucci, if you are there, I would love to bring you on. Is that okay with you, Peter?
Absolutely.
I'm asking, okay, I've just clicked ask to start the video. Now let's see if we can get Andrew Bellucci. This is Andrew Bellucci, may be related to Bellucci family, which I think we have some members of in the group right here. And definitely involved with, he's a pizza maker, brought Lombardi's back in 1994. I just requested that he share a video, but maybe he's unable to. That's okay. Okay, so another question that's in here. Okay, by the way, if, people who are asking questions, oh, here we got Andrew. Anyway, before we get to Andrew, people who are asking the questions in here, please be as specific as possible, because sometimes I see one that says, is it possible that he owned the business? And please specify who the he would be. So let's see, Andrew Bellucci, I am unmuting you, and it should work right now. There you go,
Okay.
Bring it.
So you can hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay.
So ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Bellucci.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, can you clarify that question, Andrew?
Sure.
I
My
see
question
you're
is,
guessing that's not, you said you're guessing that's not a fact, but I don't
right.
know.
There were a number of times where Peter said, this is what we think, right? Yes. Do you have definitive evidence that that photo was taken in 1908 and not 1914?
Yeah.
Yes. I think you missed the beginning of the conversation. So
what's the, please.
Yeah. Peter, can you bring it back up? Is that possible?
Sure.
I mean, the short version of it, I don't want to go too much about bringing things back up because we have a recording of this. You can watch it. But there was an alteration to the building done in 1914. And because,
right.
Yeah, because that alteration is not, or
12, Scott.
12, yeah, that's why I'm like, wait. Because the alteration was in 1912, and in the photo, it's a photo of a pre-alteration building. We know that it wasn't 1914. We know that it wasn't 1903 because Gennaro wasn't in America yet, so it leaves it at 1908. All right, do you have another theory behind the photo?
Yes, I have anecdotal evidence in addition to the census evidence and other documents that the Bellucci family, after Gennaro married Filomena Bellucci in 1910, backed him at Lombardi's at 53.5 Spring Street in 1912. That's why I'm saying 1914 falls into line with that theory.
Right, but we know that the photo wasn't taken. We know it was taken before 1914.
12, Scott.
Yeah. No, well, yeah, but what I'm saying is we know it was taken before 1914.
Yeah.
Which includes 1912. I'm just saying, I don't think Andrew's correct. We should talk more about this offline, but
I would also add,
census records for that.
Yeah, I would also add, there's more information that we didn't talk about, but you know well about it. We have the World War I cards, which supports the fact that Francisco Dorico in 1917 was the owner of 53.5 Spring Street. And then we have Gennaro Lombardi as the owner of 234 North 5th Street in the 1917.
Yeah.
Then we have the 1918 one of an employee of Gennaro Lombardi saying Gennaro Lombardi owns 53.5 Spring Street in the 1918. So because of these World War I draft cards, we know exactly that there was a change in ownership somewhere between the 1917 and the 1918 between Francisco Dorico and Gennaro Lombardi. We also have all the city directories. Gennaro Lombardi was never in a city directory before the 19. That would be unheard of for a proprietor of that.
Before 19 when?
Before 1919, he was never in a city directory.
as a business owner.
As a
53.
business owner in Manhattan. He was
Right.
in the 1912 one and the 1913 one in Brooklyn.
So if he's not listed as a proprietor prior to 1919, I still don't understand how you're certain that he was a proprietor in 1908.
Yeah, well, so the only way that he's a proprietor is because we have that photograph. That is the only reason why we know. I mean, the only other way is that's a forgery. And I don't believe it's a forgery because it's so complicated to do that. There would be no way to do that. That evidence, I actually have the architectural plans that show specifically what the old building looked like and what the alteration was. And it's exactly the same as the photograph under the old one. So it's showing that was on or before 1912, that photograph was taken, no doubt about it.
I think we, Andrew, I'll call you later. Like we can talk more about this, and I'm curious to hear all the census stuff that you're talking about. But everything that we're talking about, there's always room for error. Peter's always saying we think, because it's just the most information we have leads there. We wouldn't know anything unless we had a time machine.
Of course, always room for error.
So anyway, okay, cool. So we'll talk more later for sure. I'm gonna just end the video just so we can go on because there's 16 other questions that I want to try to blitz past. But let's see.
Scott, I'll just say that I saw Gio Bruno's the name on that list, and that's the Bruno family that we were talking about.
Yeah, do you I don't know if you can see the list of people who are here, but
I can see the list.
I would love to, okay, you can see it. So you can go ahead and shout out people who are here. And I would love to, if you don't mind sticking around, I'd love to turn on people's video. Just give us a couple seconds to answer these questions, because I'd love to see everybody in the same spot whose families are the ones we're talking about. So anyway, Jeff Farasano is in the space right now asking, what is the oldest photo of an actual pizza?
Right, and we talked about this, and I don't know is the answer, but I think the photograph that I showed of the boys with the pizzas on 112th Street is the oldest one that I know of. Now, there may be an early one, and they have the famous Lombardi one inside the restaurant that we still don't know exactly what year that was from.
Yeah, with the family holding the pizza.
The family.
So at least in America, the oldest we have is late 1920s.
Yeah, so that photograph was taken July 1928.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So let's see. There are a couple other things that have come up here. Who owned, oh, okay, this one I think we went over, but who owned 53.5 Spring Street in 1908? Not the building, but the business.
Right, so that's the key. Right, so it goes from Santillo owned the business. He came back from the Naples in October of the 1907. And he changed it from a restaurant. So he actually does have it as the proprietor of the pizzeria in early 08. And then by the canvassing for the 08 general directory, which was done in May, June of the 1908, he is shown as involved in candy there, which is kind of amazing. And then we have the photograph of Gennaro Lombardi and Antonio Pero. And because of the November time period of that time and everything that is aligned at that time period, I surmise that photo was taken in November of 1908, by certainly the fall or the summer of that year.
Right. Okay, real quickly, Colin Kaplan is saying that the earliest photo of pizza in the US that he knows of is a Frank Pepe photo from 1925.
Oh, my, you beat me. Okay.
And Colin, is that, and let's bring Colin on for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
Colin, is that the photo of him standing in front of the business of the spot in 1925? Let's see if we can get Colin in here. Oh, there he is.
Where is he?
Okay, I've just hit the unmute button. I don't know how that all happened. I thought of it and it happened. So Colin, I don't know if it might take a second. Here we go.
I can do it. All right.
So yeah, can do you have a photo handy?
Yeah.
I'm making you a co-host so you can share it with
Okay. So you want me to share screen?
Yeah, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
By the way, this is Colin Kaplan. He's the author of Pizza in New Haven, an amazing book. He runs Taste of New Haven tours. They do pizza tours. They do other kinds of tours. And he's going to be doing a similar lecture to this His book is so dense with information that it will blow your mind. If all you know about New Haven is Sally's and Pepe's, just wait for this. It's going to be crazy. And that class is on Wednesday, September 16th, right, Colin?
Yep, I can't wait.
Yeah, we'll be here doing the same thing. Let's see this picture.
Okay, I'm bringing it up. I'm going to share my screen.
And by the way, the three of us, I know you can't see Peter's face because it's just a black square, and us and Norma Knepp, who's in here, and Frank John Quinto, who might be here. Like a lot of us, we are obsessed with looking at these kind of photos. So this is a 1925 photo, right?
Yeah, this is this is Frank Pepe.
It is a famous photo.
This is their first public photo. This is their first sort of advertisement photo. He started his business in 1925. So judging just everything says this is from that time.
That's awesome.
Based on, yeah, I mean, evidence of later photos, we have that, but his face, he looks like a kid. So this is the whole point of this story is how do we prove anything? And some of it we have to actually make deduction, use deductive reasoning, and circa 1925.
Yeah, it's so hard to, and we're definitely going to find a photo from earlier than this. At some point it's going to happen.
Absolutely.
It's hard because they're not labeled pizza and they're not in a file that says pizzeria. It's Italian fairs. It's who knows what it is. It's just constant digging. So I would love to, there's a lot of Marescas here and Brunos and Silvestros and Bellucci's. I want to try to invite everybody to share their video. Is that okay, Peter?
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't know I wonder if I can do that with like one button. I might have to hit multiple buttons. But I'm just going to go down the list and I'm going to ask pretty much everybody to share their video. If you are a descendant of one of these pizza families, please share your video.
God, if you see Adana there, she's the descendant through the marriage of Filippo Meloni. She was there before, but I think she might have had to drop out if I don't see her now.
Oh, maybe. Well, listen, I don't know if you can share your own video, then please go ahead and do it. And it might be even really fun if we can, it might be chaotic, but maybe we'll go around and everybody can let us know who they are. It's going to be very chaotic. And Peter, can you talk a little bit more about Pops? Because I know we have some Pops family in the room.
Sure. Pops is, yeah, it's that old thing. Depending on where you look, you get the piece of information. It seems to have been started by Filippo Meloni in 1906. It's at 120 Van Brunt. Meloni has it from 06 to about 1912. Francisco Dorico takes the lease from Antonio Sessa's estate. And we see next in there who Francisco trained was Ferdinando Romano and Salvatore Maresca. They're there by 1912, it looks like. And then by 1915, they're owning the building. And they're in the 1915 census there. And from then on, it's Romano Maresca operation. Romano eventually moves away and goes to Francisco Dorico's spot on 13th Avenue and has that until he dies.
Off the top of your head, man. All right, so it looks like we've got everybody. I think I've asked everybody. I'm going to unmute everybody if you want to be, and we'll see if we can do this in an orderly way. If you can chime in, maybe I'll call on you, and then if you can say who you are and your relationship and all that kind of stuff, I would love to do that. Let me try to get more people to share their video. I apologize if I keep asking you to start video. I'm just not doing a good job of keeping track of who I've already requested it from. So how about this? Anthony Venezia. I look and I see you. Wait, can you share if you can unmute yourself? I don't know if you all can.
Sure, what's going on?
Hey, Anthony, what's up?
I did not expect to be on the internet tonight. Sorry, I'm not.
You don't have to share your video, people. How can we not? Like, look at this. This is important history.
Too late now.
So, Anthony, what's the pizza family you're in?
Maresca.
All right. Look at this. What about Luann? Luann's iPad? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh,
I'm going to go on mute again.
that's cool.
All right. Enjoy.
Thanks, Anthony.
No problem. What's up, Peter?
Okay, well, how about Laura? Laura Banerjee. Oh, yeah, I just saw you just pulled yourself on mute. Or JP and Chanel. You guys are over here. Hey.
He's not.
Hey, oh, it's JP. What's up, guys? Oh, I'm like, oh, what's up? Guys, these are just some great pizza lovers right here, and I love seeing your guys' faces. What about, oh, Emily.
Hi.
Hey, Emily.
My grandmother was a Maresca, so I'm also here representing the Marescas.
Maresca's representing big time right here. What about, wait, Storage Mac Top? I know that's not your name, but share with us what's going on. I don't think he knows this, but your computer is called Storage Mac Top. It's a very cool name. Let's go to Joe Silvestro. Joe, how are you?
Okay, Scott, how about you?
Great to see you.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you. I represent the Silvestro Dorico family of pizzerias. My father was the oldest of 5 brothers. My great uncle was Francesco. My great grandfather was Tamaro. Then my grandmother was a Dorico. They started Joe's, and they named it. It started before my father was born, but they named it Joe's because my father was the oldest of 5 brothers. Unfortunately, we had to close in 1999 after many, many years, probably 80 some years of business. But I'm happy. I really was happy to hear about all the families and all the information that you gave. So wonderful, wonderful show.
Thanks, Joe.
What about, wait,
Thanks,
Stuart.
Peter. To hear from you.
Yeah, good to
Stuart's
hear you.
here. Stuart Candace, let's see, are you unmuted? We'll see if we can get you to, hey,
Hi, can you hear me?
we got you now.
Yeah, so that's my wife's computer, but I'm a Maresca. Emily's my daughter. My great-grandfather, Salvatore Maresca, owned Pops. And a lot of us remember Pops. We ate at Pops. My mother was a waitress there when she was a teenager. The Casenzas, their mother was a waitress there. And Laura Laporto, her mother, also was a waitress there. And her grandfather took it over after my great-grandfather gave it up. I don't know what year. But we all remember Pops because my parents, my mother and her sisters and brother all grew up upstairs. So we went to that building our whole childhood. And Pops was a famous place. I just mentioned it once accidentally on a Facebook page. And I got, within an hour, I had 80 comments of people who remembered everybody about Pops, including a guy who had a crush on my aunt. And it was amazing. Stories from 50, 60 years ago. But anyway, I think Peter or you sent Anthony an ad from the Brooklyn Eagle about
Right,
Pops
exactly.
Pizzeria. We never saw that before. Very interesting.
Well, that is a very interesting ad because it implies that something opened up in 1895. And it's that old thing of what do you mean by date of establishment? It's interesting that that date or that year, 1895, keeps popping up. And the question is, was that sort of the story that came down through the families that was told of when Meloni started his first business, which eventually came to be Pops?
Well, maybe my grandmother didn't come until 1902. I think the Marescas may have come not long before that. So I don't think they ran the business there from 1895, but
No.
maybe they just said that's when the building was built. Who knows? I think they all made stuff up.
Well, I think what Peter was saying before is so true. It's not necessarily making stuff up. It's just the slip of a word, and especially when English is not your first language. And once you say, oh, I got there on Tuesday, suddenly it becomes, oh, I've been here since Tuesday. And that becomes, like last Tuesday or next Tuesday. It's just language. And it's not like somebody made something up or lied. It's just these stories are the family. Nothing could ever get in the way of a family story. It doesn't change your family. It just,
Yeah, the real point I'm making is that if Meloni started a business, maybe in Italian Harlem in 1894 or 5, and he starts the businesses, when did his business actually start? Do you go by the address, or do you go by the first time he worked in the business in America and owned a shop? So that's why it's possible that what that story is referring to is when Meloni first owned a pizzeria in the United States. Now that's a guess, it's speculation, but that's the type of thinking that is useful, I think.
and it's, Peter, you and I were talking about this yesterday about how John's Pizzeria claims 1929. We can't figure out what that even lines up with, because it was at McDougal Street, and then before that it was at 175 Sullivan, and the business seed that became John's really was planted and grow in 1915. So could they hypothetically start saying that they've been around since 1915? Could Lombardi start saying that they've been around since 1898?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But
It's
anyway, thank you. I know that Peter had some building permits that showed, I think, when my great-grandfather put running water into 120 Van Brunt Street, because imagine running a restaurant without running water. And I know that they just had coal ovens, so they shoveled in the coal, and there was no hot water up in the upper floors where my mother lived, and her siblings. But it's interesting. And I know that my aunt said that because it was right on the docks, literally, like today, if you go to see 120 Van Brunt Street, it's part of the docks. During the war, there were so many ships coming and going, and business was so good that my great-grandfather expanded and put a dining room upstairs. It was a basement restaurant. Put a dining room upstairs and put in running water, and apparently made a lot of money because there was so much business from the docks, especially lunch and dinner, and 7 days a week. So I guess he did okay until the end, but the restaurant was there quite a long time.
The other thing I'd add about this, Scott, that I didn't talk about. Hello?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
No, I'm just going to add something about Pox in the context of what was going on in that neighborhood. There was a pizzeria, well, there still was, but there was a pizzeria owner at 42 Union Street, which is right around the corner.
Right.
That had a pizzeria there from 1898, and he dies in 1904. It's interesting. Did that mean with his death that neighborhood did not have a pizzeria anymore? And is that why Meloni went back to the neighborhood and opened up, which eventually then became Pops in 1906 or so?
Maybe. Well, I'm not sure where my mother was born exactly, but her younger sister, Jenny, who's still alive, was born on Union Street.
Yeah.
And one of my grandmother's little brother died in a fire on Union Street on that block. So they did live on that block, and they all came from Piano di Sorrento, which is where I think, not Meloni, somebody came from.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
he was born there. But once you see the context of what they were dealing with, the fact that they didn't have a pizzeria in the neighborhood, it wouldn't surprise me that they called them back.
That could, yeah, I'm sure. You know, growing up in an Italian house, we didn't go out to Italian restaurants that much because you cooked at home, or grandma cooked at home. So you would go out for pizza, but there were not a lot of Italian restaurants, you know, until later on in the 50s and 60s, you know. But
Now, what street did you grow up on?
I grew up on President Street,
Oh, sure. Okay.
one block up from Van Brunt. So, but until the 1960s, my grandmother lived at 120 Van Brunt. So we would go there quite often for Sunday dinner, or, you know, for the whole family get together.
Very good. Very good.
Well, this is awesome. Such great stories. I want to thank Peter for being here. We do it. I do like a pizza history talk every Wednesday night. Peter is almost always there and adding in such great information. Peter and I have done some of these lectures before together, and it's just so great and an honor to do this with people who are, first of all, great pizza makers. There are great pizza makers here. Norma Knepp is here. Michael Ayub is here. Jeff Varsano is here. But also the people, those are people who are inspired by everyone else who's in this space, all your families. doing something that they probably never thought was that important, and that people wouldn't be on a video phone call on a Wednesday night to talk about them and where they lived in what year and if they were a grocery or a deli. But here we are, it's 2020. So thank you all for coming. Thanks, Peter. Colin Kaplan will be here in 2 weeks, on the 16th of September. Please join us then. You can get his book at pizzaInNewHaven.com. There are millions of questions I'm sure you have. Please, Peter's website is pizzahistorybook.com. If you need to get in touch with me, it's just scottspizzatours.com or Scott's Pizza Tours on Instagram. And thank you all for coming. This has been a real honor.
Hold on, Scott, don't close it out.
Yeah.